Audio loops can feel loopy. For electrical or mechanical sources, this can be fine since these are inherently repetitive. But for other things, we want to look at ways to break up this looping feeling because it can feel artificial. We're going to look at a simple way to make things feel less loopy through combining two or more different length loops. We'll also start using the sound cue system. This allows us to build audio playback systems or units of sound rather than simply playing back individual wave files. In the demonstration project, we're just going to walk from the village, which has got an ambient sound loop in it, out towards the meadow. And we've set these up so we get a nice crossfade between the two. Now the meadow at the moment has got an ambient sound actor, and this is the sound that is assigned to it. I'm going to browse to that here, and you can hear that it's a kind of background cricket type loop. Now that's going to get a bit boring, and we want to add a bit more life to our meadow. So what we're going to do is in our ambience folder, going to right click, sounds, sound cue. And we're going to create a sound cue called area loop meadow with wind. Double clicking on that will open the sound cue editor. Now this uses a node-based approach, and this is going to become very familiar to you both through the sound cue editor and through blueprints later on. Essentially we have different nodes that do different things and we attach them together with wires. We are going to use several sounds, so the first thing I'm going to bring in here is the mixer, and I'm going to connect that to the output. Now we're going to retain that original sound of the crickets. So this is selected, and I'm going to right click and add a wave player to play that cricket sound back. Now, even though that sound wave has been designated as a looping sound inside the content browser, now we're using it within a sound cue, we need to reassign its characteristics. So over here, we've got it as a wave player, but if I do want it to loop, I'm going to need to check this box to make it a looping wave player. So that's going to go into our mixer here. And that's going to stay at volume 1, I think, for the moment. And now I'm going to add another sound to it, which is going to be a kind of background wind sound. So I'm in my audio folder. I'm going to search for wind. I've got this meadow wind. Again, I could select this and bring it into the sound cue editor, or I can drag and drop it, make that into a looping file, and that's going to be a bit quieter. If you're used to working in a DAW or digital audio workstation, then you're going to find these volume multipliers a little bit strange at first, since they don't represent the logarithmic scale of decibels that you might be used to. You're going to find yourself working sometimes with some quite small values here. So let's have a listen to this sound cue so far. Now it's a bit more interesting than simply having the cricket sound, and it's also made more interesting because these sound files are actually of different lengths. So they are going to change relationship to each other as they loop around. The other thing we could do here is set up this idea of asynchronous loops. So we could take this wind file and we could actually play it against itself, but at a different pitch perhaps, so that again, as it loops round, it always falls into a different relationship with itself. So you see, as the original sound begins to start again, it's actually playing against a different proportion of, say, the pitch shifted sound. And the next time it loops, it's going to be playing against a different part of that sound again. So each time, actually, the product of these sounds, although they're not changing themselves, the product of the sound is new. So if we go back to our sound cue, we can make a copy of this, and we can use the modulator node to change its pitch. We'll just add another input to our mixer. So the modulator, I'm going to say the minimum pitch it might be is 0.7. And then sometimes when we walk into this area, it might be playing at a slightly different pitch. I don't want it to be radically different, but just a subtle variation, so 0.75. And tweak the volume of this one, and then let's hear this sound cue. Obviously we don't have time to listen to the wondrous intricacies of these combinations, but as each wind loop comes around, it's going to be playing against a slightly pitch shifted version of itself, and so you should get this ebb and flow of the wind that never quite sounds like a loop, it's always changing. We're just going to add a final touch and add some grasses that might be blowing in this wind. Drag and drop. Again, I'm going to set that wave player to be a looping wave player, add an input to my mixer, bring that in, set a volume, and we have our final sound cue for the meadow. We'll select our ambient sound actor in the meadow, find the sound cue we just created, which was AL meadow with wind, and we'll assign that sound cue to the ambient sound actor. And because the ambient sound actor has got its attenuation overridden, it will just fit into the same space as we were before. So now we can go back to our village and hopefully walk into a slightly more interesting meadow. And I'm sure we could sit and listen to that all day, but we must move on. This idea of setting up asynchronous loops that change relationships to each other, it's a really easy, good way of generating variation in your background area loops. Of course, we must always think about the implications of what we're doing. This mixer is not actually mixing all these sounds down into a single voice. There are still 4 voices being taken up by this sound cue, and in certain circumstances that might be excessive. We need to think about how the player is actually going to be experiencing this. Are they going to be in this area for a long time, in which case we might want to generate some variation and take the hit on the sound voices, or if they're just going to be running and gunning through this area very quickly, then maybe that original sound of just the crickets looping is totally sufficient. It depends on your game, on your platform, and on the amount of time that the player might be staying in a particular location. We've had a bit of an introduction to the sound cue editor. We've looked at how you can use the mixer node to combine sounds and the modulator node to pitch shift them. We've also discussed how mixing together 2 different versions of the same sound can be a useful way of breaking up that sense of looping that we can sometimes get with these area loops. And we've also discussed how we shouldn't get carried away with building hugely complex sound cues. It should depend upon the context within your specific game.